So if you've ever ridden the New York City subway, you probably noticed that it's a lot more complicated than other systems. Not just because it's big, and not just because there are 4 tracks with local and express service, but partly because you never really know for sure which track a given train is going to go down. And that's because, in general, all the tracks are on one level and in one tunnel. So I never thought about this before I looked into this. It seems obvious. How else would the tracks be besides one level? But it doesn't have to be this way, and it's not that way on other parts of the New York City subway. Some parts it's stacked like this on Lexington Avenue. You've got 2 tracks over 2 tracks, and there were other proposals to have 2 tracks on the same level, but not in a single tunnel. There's just 2 separate tubes, and a lot of systems are built this way, like the London Underground in particular, the so-called tube, because there are a bunch of tubes, and you can see in this drawing that for the most part, each track is in a separate tube. Here you got the Metropolitan or the District and Circle line, where it's 2 tracks in the single tube, and that because that's one of the older lines that was originally built for steam. It's right below the surface, but most of the tube lines, even if they're on the same level, they're in a separate tunnel. There's actually all kinds of really cool looking cutaways you can find of the London Underground if you search for it. And you can see this tube structure is part of what contributes to the hedge maze-like aspect of the London Underground. So today we're going to talk about, in New York City, why all the tracks are on one level and in one tunnel, and how this explains why the subway is so confusing today. And then also going to talk about the very, very interesting runner-up design that had 2 different levels. So welcome to Making Infrastructure Pay. I'm Kyle Kirschling. I'm a CPA, a city planner. I worked for over 10 years for the New York City Subway, and I'm a transportation consultant. And I'm particularly interested in infrastructure and economics. And like and subscribe if you enjoy the videos, please. And as a disclaimer, these ideas, they're my own ideas. They don't represent those of the New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority, my former employer, nor do they represent those of my current employer. They're my own ideas. Now, this is actually the 5th in a series about the design of the New York City subway. And this today is the 5th thing, sort of the last of what I consider the major design decisions that were made in 1891 when the design for the subway came together. And what we're talking about is, why are all the tracks on one level and in one tunnel? So just in case you're not familiar with the New York City subway, in general, all the tracks are on a single level and they're in a single tunnel like this, whether you've got 4 tracks or even just 2 tracks or more. The main exception is where they can't fit them. The street isn't wide enough. And sometimes they put them on the same level even when they can't fit them. Here you see it spills beyond the street. This is a 6-track station at Hoyt-Schermerhorn, and they still put it on one level. But this was a big decision back in 1891, whether to try to in general have the system all tracks on one level, or whether to double deck it. So I first want to mention the benefits of just in general having multiple levels or separate tunnels. So the first thing I'm going to mention is that if you have separate tunnels and you're talking about a deep tunnel, it requires less excavation. You don't have to remove as much material because the tunnels are generally round in order to cut the tunnels. So I just made this little illustration. Here you've got 4 separate, so these are 4 tracks in one tunnel, and you've got 4 tracks in separate tunnels. And if I did my calculations correctly, a tunnel of this diameter would require about 8 times as much material to be removed as one of these. So it's not 4 times, which you would think, it's like 8 times. So in other words, you end up taking about twice as much material to build a tunnel of this diameter, and that's mainly because you have this wasted space above it and below it to achieve the round shape. You save a little bit because you only need 1 walkway. You don't need space for 4 walkways, but by having separate tunnels, If you're talking about a deep tunnel design, it's less excavation, less cost. And again, this was something that they had considered. Like this proposal from 1891, this is one of the consultant engineers had recommended this type of a design for part of it, or this other proposal, which I've shown you guys before. If you were to have 4 tracks on one level, it would become a pretty big arch and you'd be taking out a lot. You'd have to remove a lot more material. And if you're talking about a more shallow tunnel, then the main benefit is that you can fit it. You can see with 4 tracks here where there's a station, it's coming up right to the front of the building foundations. So it's using all the space. It's right up against these buildings. So that's the other advantage, is that it's just easier to fit it, which means you can leave the so-called vaults. They call them vaults, which were underneath the sidewalks. A lot of the businesses, their basements extended out. So if you were to deck it, you wouldn't have to encroach upon the vaults, and you wouldn't be as close to the foundations of the building. So they would be safer to construct. So the benefits of having multiple levels could be less stuff to excavate, less material, which is cheaper, and just the fact that you could fit it without having to disturb the buildings or come up next to the foundations. And the plan that they were most thinking about, that was the runner-up that they spent a lot of time debating, was the so-called Parsons plan. Parsons was the assistant engineer on the commission itself. So you've got the commissioners, the commission engineers, and then the consulting engineers. And there was the Parsons plan. He was advocating a double deck plan, and you had the Worthen plan, which was the single level plan that they ultimately adopted. But the Parsons plan is very interesting and very thoughtful, and I just wanted to share some of the things that they were thinking about and some of the features that it had. So here's a good view of it. This is the street. You have the local trains on the upper level, the express trains on the lower level. So this is showing how it would look when there was not a station. On this side is where there is a station. These are the platforms. And what it does is it has this in the middle here, a so-called pipe gallery. So this is where you would put the utilities rather than have them be in the surface, between the street and the roof of the tunnel. You would have the utilities in this so-called pipe gallery. And what that does is that allows these local trains to be really close to the surface, because it pushes the tracks outside these yokes. These structures are the yokes. That is where the cableway would be for the streetcars, or later the electric third rail ran in there. And this is sort of the limiting factor, because you couldn't really move them. So by putting utilities there and moving the tracks to the side, you could get these platforms very close to the surface, saving few steps, saving many steps, making it very few steps to get there. Basically as close as you could possibly get to the surface by doing this. So I think that the first interesting feature is how it allows you to get the local trains as close to the surface as you possibly can. Another thing is that if you take this design, it wouldn't be that difficult to make every station an express station. You could build the platforms at every station and then make it an express station whenever you needed to. Because really the only difference is that you're not going to excavate this part out at a local station. It would just only excavate this part at where you have an express station. But you could do that at all stations. You don't have to move the tracks or anything. The tracks would be in the same exact location. And so not only would that mean in the future you could make any station an express station, because if you have maintenance, or if it's at night, you could just use the lower tracks and shut down the upper tracks for maintenance or whatever, or vice versa. So you could easily take one track or the other track out of service and still stop at every station. Now it has this pipe gallery, and that was very popular with some people. Some people really like the idea of not having to constantly be ripping up the streets in order to do work, to have this so-called gallery where all the pipes would be located, and the only time you'd have to interfere with the street would be when you are going to repave it, because the workmen can go down here and work on the utilities whenever they want. It's the reason it's between the tracks instead of outside them is so that at the station areas they don't have to step around it. Otherwise, you might have to step down and up. So that's why it's between the tracks, so you doesn't get in the way of the stations. Also, by having the utilities here, they're not above the track. So in some cases, certain types of leaks and things maybe would not affect the track as much. The subway would be more protected in a sense. And then if you needed more space, you could just dig it deeper. So it could be expanded in the future. Another thing about this plan is that Parsons recognized that, unlike others, apparently, that, well, he wasn't the only one, but he sort of saw the potential that he realized that we're not going to be running regular trains, passenger trains, on this system. I think the idea was there were some people who thought, well, it should be designed to accommodate normal sized trains. Maybe it might actually connect. You might actually take trains that are coming from other cities and run them on the subway. And he realized that that's probably not going to happen, and you wouldn't want to do that anyway. So let's design a car specifically for this, and that way it can be smaller, it can be lighter, which means it can be faster, and it will take up less space. And by being shorter, in particular, he came with this special low height design where the wheels come up into the body. You still have the floor is still flat throughout, but by making it less tall, then what that does is it allows the platform to be a little bit closer to the surface, both of these platforms, because the car is shorter. So it's not the express. It takes more steps to get down to the express tracks, but not as many more steps as if without this, as you'd have without this shorter car design. So it came with a special car design just to make this work, to make the express tracks even a little bit closer than they otherwise would be. Not as close as with single level, but close, but not that much deeper, and certainly closer to the surface than they would be otherwise. And then the last sort of feature about this is that the it was believed, at least, that the ventilation would be achieved by sort of a piston effect of the trains, because you have the local and express trains going in one direction on this side, and the trains on this other side going in the same direction. And so since this would largely be enclosed and it would be separated from the pipe gallery, there would be some kind of a wall there. So when the trains are moving by, that would provide most of the ventilation. So I think it's a very thoughtful plan, a very interesting plan, and it's really neat how he really tried to get it as close to the surface as he could. Even came up with this separate special design for a car to make it work even a little bit better. So, but they didn't go with that. They really only directed in places where they did not have the physical space. So what they did is they went with the Worthen plan with this guy. And I want to talk about that. So here you have 1, 2, 3, 4 tracks on a single level, the Worthen plan. So why did they pick this? Why did they go with this? Well, they really, really cared about flexibility, they wanted to have interlockings and redundancy to be able to operate around any kind of delay or obstacle. So it was very much, they were very concerned with operational flexibility in running the subway. And by having the tracks on one level, that is much more achievable than with the double deck plan. Quote, another and most serious question which the Commission was obliged to consider was facility of movement between the different tracks in emergencies causing congestion and delay. No system of rapid transit would be complete that did not provide on its main trunk line at numerous points for the movement of trains from either track to any other, and the transfer of passengers from disabled trains, if need be, at any point between stations. This in the double deck plan could be but partially accomplished. While with 4 tracks on one level, the entire blockade of the system would be almost an impossibility. And then they go on to say, so important is this consideration, being able to deal with delays, to go around blockages. So important is this consideration that the Commission would be loath to recommend any plan wanting in the feature. It would have been regarded as essential, even had the Commission adopted a plan for a tunnel at greater depth than the one now reported. Now, that really surprised me because what they're saying is that even if they were considering a deep tunnel design, which they were, something like this, they still would have wanted all the tracks to be on one level, one enormous tunnel with 4 tracks. So they really were concerned about operational flexibility, especially a lot of some of these people were railroad men and they had experience with railroads, and they do talk a lot about the importance of this flexibility. In my opinion, it is essential to the successful operation of any system of rapid transit to have, at suitable intervals, crossovers between the up and down lines of both local and express service, and also at important stations, at least one middle standing track. Without such adjuncts to the system, the traffic becomes completely blocked by a disabled train, broken track, or other accident at any point on the line. With them, trains can be kept moving over all other parts of the system, and relief to the whole system obtained much more quickly. It seems to me that it is very important that the 4 tracks should be so laid as to permit the transfer of cars and trains from any track to either of the other tracks at any time and at many points along the line. In case of cars or engine breaking down, or of any accident, traffic can be maintained easily by methods well known to railway managers if there are frequent opportunities for transfer. With regard to this point, the plan which provides 4 tracks on one level is, in my opinion, superior to the double deck plan. That a plan with the 4 tracks upon the same level is decidedly preferable because it would best promote the transfer of passengers from one train to another, local or express, and because it would permit the transfer of cars and trains from any track to either of the other tracks. And the plan proposed by Mr. Worthen, the single level plan, crossings could be laid as frequently as might be deemed desirable, a simple change of arrangement of the central columns being required at such points. There's just kind of a picture that essentially, I mean, you have to strengthen the beams in that area, but you've got, I believe there's actually 4 tracks here, or 5 tracks here rather. But essentially, yeah, you just read, as simple as he says, change of arrangement of the columns. Yeah, remove the columns from here, and then you can have an interchange. And the MTA actually has a lovely video that they talk about this feature and how all of the interlockings, essentially the intersections for trains where you can switch from one track to another, that there are so many interlockings on the New York City subway because of this concern with having this flexibility. They talk about how that affects service.
Having so many different interlockings and track combinations also means that if there's a problem on a line or construction that needs to be done, we can divert trains onto another track or even onto another line entirely. You can't do this on many other systems. There, if a train is stuck, all the trains behind it are stuck too.
Now, the other issue that is sort of related to this flexibility in a sense is the idea of having junctions and branch lines. The lines of road, as shown by your plans, appear to have been located with good judgment for the best interest of the public and are capable of future extension by branch lines whenever business interests of the future growth of the city may require it. In this relation, the design adopted for the road should be that which, unless outbalanced by other considerations, allows the best facilities for connections with branch lines. So they had really imagined that you would have a few trunk lines on the subway and that you could start building lots of branch lines to add service or to connect new parts of the city. So that was another consideration. It's sort of related to the flexibility, because to have the branch lines, you also need to connect in other tracks. It's a little more complicated than merely switching from one track to any other, but it is easier to make connections without grade crossings by having all the tracks on one level. Because with this double deck plan, if you want to have an interchange, you've got to go even deeper down. So you've got to get to at least 3 levels if you're going to have some kind of a flyover and have tracks crossing without having grade crossings. And also you have this pipe gallery in the way. So if you want to switch between the uptown and the downtown trains, then you've got to move this, or you've got to again go deep down, create another level. It's not nearly as simple to add connections or to add branch lines. And in that nice little video by the MTA, they explain interlining and how the many merges and diverges affects the way service is structured.
In most cities, each subway route has the tracks mostly or all to themselves. The large number of interlockings in the New York City subway is one of the things that makes it unique among the world's metro systems. That's why the New York subway can seem so much more complicated than other systems. It's not just because we're big, but it's also because we merge our routes much more often.
And indeed, the fact that they decided to build the subway with all tracks on one level and all tracks in a single tunnel, and therefore lots of interlockings, lots of places where the trains can connect, then that also means you can have lots of options with how the service is structured. So you can have trains merging and diverging, sharing tracks, splitting off onto their own tracks again, which is very different from other systems. Now, they never talk about this in 1891 or in that era. They don't talk about interlining. I mean, then the main benefit for passengers is that by having these merges and diverges, you can have a 1-seat ride because from many different places, because the train can just switch on to different tracks and you can get where you're going without having to switch trains. Most other subways, there's a separate line for every service, and every train stops at every station, and it's pretty simple. But the reason to have the interlining is essentially to have more 1-seat rides. So they never talk about that. They never talk about having a 1-seat ride or that concern. They're concerned with being able to have branches and junctions, and especially this operational flexibility so that they can move trains around and deal with emergencies and delays and things like that, and have that flexibility. That's what they talk about. But what that allows is the system to have all these merges and diverges in regular service, not just for emergencies, but for regular service, to provide that 1-seat ride. So that, I think that the fact that there are so many merges and diverges on the subway service is probably even more a source of confusion for passengers than is the local and express system. And again, this traces right back to this original design. Now, another reason that they went with the Worthing plan, the single level, was that it makes it easier to transfer from local to express trains. Again, here in the Parsons plan, if you want to go from local to express, you're going to have to go upstairs, downstairs, and make many more steps. Whereas, with the system as it is today, at an express station, you're just walking across the platform to transfer from local to express. So they talk about that many times. So that was sort of a third reason why they went with the all the tracks on one level. Now, there are a few smaller reasons also, which seem to help push them towards all tracks on one level. For one thing, with the Parsons plan, you would still, even double decking it, you would still be encroaching on some of the vaults. So it doesn't completely solve that problem anyway. Also, a lot of people some of the engineers on the commission, the Rapid Transit Commission, were not excited about the idea of the pipe gallery, of being responsible for that. And there were concerns about what happens if you have, a gas leak or something in one of these pipes, and you're in a tunnel and it's right next where the passengers are. At least if it happens in the, the way it is today, it's surrounded by earth. It's not going to just leak right into the subway. So and then just the responsibility of having these pipe galleries, and being responsible for building this, and the way it might get in the way of operating the railroad. So there were just a lot of concerns about that. Even though, again, some people were really like that idea, especially in the public, of just not having to rip up the streets all the time. And then the last thing just had to do with noise and ventilation. And it was thought that it would be quieter by having everything in one tunnel, one big tunnel, rather than separate tunnels. And I think part of the reason they're concerned with that was because actually just the year before, the City and South London Railway had opened, which is London's first deep level tube line. It was electrically powered, but they're pretty small. It was a pretty small diameter tunnel. The cars are pretty small. And actually, Mr. Parsons went there, and a few years later in 1894, and it was pretty hard on it. He said, the cars are small, badly ventilated and lighted, hard riding and noisy. But with this small tunnel, it was pretty loud. And you can see even on the tube lines today, the trains just barely fit. There's not even a walkway in many places. And it was, again, I don't know how much difference it makes, but it was believed that by having everything in one big tunnel, all 4 tracks on one level, that you wouldn't have all the reverberation, and that it would end up being much quieter. And they thought it would be easier to ventilate because they wanted to have artificial ventilation. If you can have artificial ventilation, if all the tracks are in one tunnel, you only have to ventilate one tunnel. So it makes it a little bit simpler in that sense. So in conclusion, there was a lot of thought about operation. They were really concerned with that operational flexibility. And then secondarily, with being able to connect in branch lines, they imagined there would be a lot of branch lines in the future. And they wanted to make the transfers between local and express as easy as possible. And even though I don't think they anticipated the idea of the 1-seat ride, that design with all 4 tracks on a single level and all of the interlockings and junctions that the New York City subway has is what makes that possible. And it's probably the number one thing that makes the New York City subway so confusing to people today. And I'm really glad that they chose that, because I really like that local express transfer, just walking across the platform. It's so easy. So that's our show for today. Until next time, I'm Kyle Kirschling. Thank you for listening. Again, like and subscribe. And if you have, if you have ideas for things you'd like to hear about, please, leave a comment. I'm open to your suggestions. Okay, take care.